Relatively little attention is paid to the role of managerial self-interests in potentially explaining the donating behaviour of the company for which they're the manager. And the literature that does examine this, the empirical literature that does examine the role of managerial self-interests, essentially does so residually. That is, it says, look, here are all the corporate interests we can identify. We'll regress donations against the corporate interests, and we'll hope that the residual captures, we'll interpret the residual basically as indicating managerial private interests. Okay. Now, we improve a bit on that. Okay? We actually identify some potential indicators of managerial private interests and stick them out on the right-hand side as well. But of course, and I'm sure people will sort of hit on this idea that, to the extent that we can't perfectly measure corporate interests for donations, if other omitted corporate interests are correlated with our measured managerial interests, then there's a potential bias there. And so we do have to spend a bit of time thinking this through in the future before this is anywhere near ready to go anyway. Okay, so the impact of managerial private interests on corporate political donations and the effectiveness of corporate governance mechanisms in constraining that sort of behaviour is not covered in the existing literature. So what we basically do is say, do managerial private interests explain or appear to explain any of the donation behaviour of the corporations for which they are the manager? And if so, do traditional governance structures or any indicators of governance strength, do they appear to moderate or mitigate the impact of managerial interests on those donations? That's the logic behind what we're doing. Okay, so there are the three questions. To what extent do corporate political donations reflect corporate interests as far as we can measure them? To what extent do those donations reflect managers and or directors' private interests? And to what extent do a corporation's monitoring and bonding mechanisms constrain the impact of those managers or directors' private interests? Okay, summary of the main results. We do find that most of our indicators are associated in the predicted direction with the corporate political donations. We have some evidence that blockholder monitoring constrains the influence of some of the managerial private interests. So basically that's the case of the incidence of blockholders who are not insiders, essentially, in the corporation, as far as we can measure it. But we find no evidence that board independence, the level of directors' shareholdings or non-executive directors' shareholdings effectively constrain donations. In fact, some of the shareholding data appears to inflate or exacerbate the impact of private interests, and that doesn't entirely surprise me because these shareholdings measures, they can be an indicator of stronger incentives, but they're also an indicator of stronger power of the directors that you're talking about. So it's not entirely surprising. And this is just to remind me, because it should have been, paper should have been presented in a slightly different way. Okay, the results that are tabulated have the left-hand side and right-hand side variables measured contemporaneously. Now, the right-hand side should be lagged. It makes our results are the same, however. So that's just to remind me to get to that point.
Just taking your first point, corporate, you call this a result. Corporate and private interests are associated with corporate political donations. And that's a result of some photo analysis tests, etc. What would you conclude had you not found statistical significance? Would you say that as a result of our study is that they don't explain?
I guess all I could say is that they either don't explain it or our proxies are.
Okay, that's the point.
Yeah, no.
That's the point. So calling that a result, you go in with, I'm a bit of a Bayesian at heart, right? You go with very strong priors.
Yeah.
If you fail to reject null, I'm not going to give up on that proposition and say I've got something wrong in my experiment.
Sure.
So calling that a result, I'm just think about whether you want to use that.
No, you're dead right. That's my carelessness. No, you're absolutely correct. Thank you. Ronnie?
Seeing the results here, I'm a little bit concerned because throughout your paper, you also include profitability, return on assets. But you actually never include that in your regressions because you don't find a difference in the companies that make donations to those that don't make donations. So you don't have a difference in the return on assets. And I'm a little bit concerned because your left-hand variable is the log of the donations, and ROA is a scaled variable. And I think that if the left-hand variable, the dependent, would be scaled by market cap or by average assets, I'm sure that the profitability at least would be as associated with donations as your other variables.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's for some reason when we prepared this paper, I don't know why Louise cut the control variables out of the tabulation. I haven't had time, I discovered that when I got to Macquarie. I haven't had time to rectify that. It actually goes the other way. Yeah, and I take your point in terms of the scaling. And we did try multiple different performance measures, and I cannot for the life of me remember why we ended up with that one in particular, but you're right. And it is significant in the opposite direction. It's actually the slightly more poorly performing firms are more, in our base models anyway, are making higher donations.
But this is only because the left-hand variable is not scaled, right? This is exactly the problem. I mean, we can come back to that when we talk about the...
Yeah, no, sure.
That's
probably a good idea. No, I think I know what you're saying. I think you're probably right.
Ronnie, you're not talking about you're doing something like that and you now have a common denominator problem.
Yeah.
So what's your answer to that?
Well, I would scale the left and right-hand side with market cap anyway and would not use assets at all, but you just use earnings.
Well, you can take two random uncorrelated numbers, and then if you apply a common scaling thing, you end up with a correlation between the two deflated measures.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, Tom will shoot you.
Yeah. He must have started off with a rather unusual structure there.
But when also, I think one of the things that Tom Smith showed was if you do have a common base, you have to adjust your standard errors because this actually causes all sorts of mischief. So, but but you've got this as a size as an explanatory variable, haven't you? Something.
Yep.
Yeah. So maybe the scaling's not so critical.
Yeah. Okay, I'll move on, and I'm more than happy. Okay. So, very quickly on potential contributions. Well, I guess for political scientists and those involved in whose interests are more in democracy, and there are potential implications for theory of regulation as it applies to disclosing the amount of these corporate political donations, because they have been changing the thresholds at which the donations become mandatory, and which actually affect the way we model things because of cut-offs in our TOBIT models. A bit ugly, so I've tried everything and it doesn't make much difference. There's some, the possibility of some relevance to corporate governance best practice in terms of at least, well, we're observing a different form of firm behaviour here, I guess, and the materiality of its importance there probably, I guess, depends on the extent to which one could extrapolate from this form of corporate behaviours, that is, donations to a corporate political party, and maybe other forms of corporate behaviour, such as donations in general. I don't want to go out on a limb on that yet, because I haven't really thought that through strongly enough. There's a broader contribution to the governance literature, I guess. As much in terms of, what do these proxies for governance quality really mean, and to what extent are we really picking up something of these board independence type measures, because they're pretty coarse proxies for the underlying construct, but they're what we've got, and I know that's not a very good excuse. We do find some evidence that also that manager or director shareholdings can actually appear to exacerbate agency problems, and we would probably argue that's due to a sort of a power or entrenchment effect. And we do, relative to the existing literature, we find slightly cleaner evidence regarding links to between donations and exposure to government decision making, because we do count the number of times firms are mentioned in Parliament, etc. We aggregate the number of government contracts awarded. Now these are still pretty fuzzy measures. We've tried several variants of them. We're limited by the data. Now that's not a good reason in itself, I know. But all I'd say is it's a step up on some of the existing literature. Okay? It's a long, long way from being perfect or even desirable. Okay, so quickly, on to our hypotheses. The first hypothesis, or hypotheses, relate to the role of corporate interests in explaining corporate political donations. Corporate political donations may be an effective means to influence government decisions which have the ability to transfer wealth to or from the corporation. The literature broadly identifies two means by which that may actually happen. One is fairly mundane and one I tend to go with, and that is making corporate political donations helps to open doors, to at least have your voice heard. And so if you've got the ear of the minister, okay, it helps your lobbyists get in, if you like, to actually be heard. And if your opponents don't get heard, even if there's no deliberate bias in government decision making, you've got a better chance of getting your way than in other cases. Then there's the more, I guess, corrupt end of the spectrum where one could argue that corporate political donations are about buying individual government decisions. I think that's where, I'm sure this happens at times, but that's not the way you go about it, given that these are disclosed. In Australia, both parliamentary and executive decisions may be influenced by donations to the party, or could conceivably be influenced, because there's strong party discipline and tend to vote along party lines. So H1A is, there's a positive association between corporations' exposure to parliamentary decision making and the level of political donations made by that corporation. Exposure to parliamentary decision making, very briefly, is a measure of how many times the corporation or its wholly owned subsidiaries are mentioned in Hansard in a given year. And H1B, there's a positive association between the corporation's exposure to government decision making outside Parliament and the level of political donations made by those corporations. Yeah.
You've mentioned the company itself and its subsidiaries, but do you also take into account any director-related entities?
In this one? In our managerial private interests, that's exactly what we do. Okay, but only when we say director-related interests, entities, they're other listed corporations. Okay.
So they're not private enterprises at all?
I'll just double check as to how far. I'll explain what I do know when we get to that one. So the proxies for these decision-making outside Parliament, the number of times the firm's mentioned in the government gazettes, excluding the tendering gazette, because the other proxy is the number of government contracts awarded. Now, we can't measure that, and that's all we can actually get. There's going to be, we don't know how many contracts firms tendered for unsuccessfully, and we don't generally know the value of the contracts, but I think what we can do is actually possibly classify some of these contracts, at least in value ranges, which is what Louise is having a look at now. Our direct managerial interest proxies, or hypotheses, sorry. We assume there's imperfect monitoring and bonding of management. Managers may have self-interested motivations to influence corporate behaviour. We've seen that in lots of spheres. And that could potentially spill over to corporate political donations. Why? What possible private benefit could a manager get from their corporation making a donation to the Liberal Party or the Labor Party or the Greens or all of the above? Well, literature identifies one motivation, and that is that managers may seek to attain and to achieve and maintain status and acceptance within their professional networks, and by their professional networks, them and their friends, many of whom sit on boards of other companies, whether they be listed companies, non-profits, etc. So one argument, which is quite, and which is covered to quite an extent in the sociology literature, is this, the managers' desire to fit in with their peers. Okay, and there is evidence that donation behaviour does cluster within these networks. It wasn't on political donations, it was on donations to charities, the existing literature from Glaskovich. Then, of course, maybe it's something to do with their own sense of personal social responsibility. Now, obviously, we can't measure that directly, but what we look at is the extent to which managers, whether executives or directors, sit on the boards of non-profits. as an indicator of at least their willingness to be perceived as being engaged with society. Now, both of those, this is where there's a more obvious endogeneity problem in what we do, and so we do try to tease that out in our sensitivity tests. There's one obvious option here is if we're going to measure, so what we use as a proxy here is the incidence of donations in other firms within a manager's directorial or professional network. Now, of course, one could argue that a firm that wants to achieve influence over the political process might actually hire directors who are already politically engaged. Okay, so there could be some degree of reverse causation there. So we do have a two-stage model, or we have a series of two-stage models that attempt to at least account for that. So we need to have we need instruments for the incidence of donations in this. We use directors' busyness, which certainly is relevant, and Sargent-type tests at least fail to suggest that those instruments are endogenous to the errors in the second equation. Now, it is what it is. We'll get to that if we get time. Okay, and so, look, I'll jump over these slides because I've just basically described the content of what is on that one, the argument being that managers and directors value professional network status. To achieve that status and to maintain it requires conforming to professional group norms. Part of those norms, at least in some business elite subcultures, relate to donations, and the existing studies have looked at charitable donations. And there is so there's page 2A, there's a positive association between the incidence of corporate political donations in managers or directors' professional networks and the level of political donations by that manager's or director's employing corporation. Okay, personal social preferences. Obviously we can't say that person is a greenie or something like that. But what we try to identify are managers who are engaged professionally outside the commercial world. So they're sitting on the board of the Wilderness Society or whatever the non-profit is. We can observe that.
Can we observe if they've been members of political parties?
Yeah, we should be able to.
Or have previously
and
sat in Parliament?
that's something that was suggested at Macquarie as well, which I've got Louise having a look at. And she did. And she came back and said there's, on her preliminary look, there's very few. I mean, one of them that came back to obviously Tim Fisher was the guy who sort of, it occurred to me straight away. I don't think we can observe if they're just a member of the political, if they're just a member of a political party, because we don't know. I mean, we know what they are, but I don't know how accurate your zero measure would be. But yeah, no, we do have to find out what we can observe from that.
But also, relating to that, if you look at who ran for past elections, those who actually ran but were unsuccessful. So if you match that against the name of the directors, maybe you might find someone who has done that before.
There aren't as many as you. Yeah, I know. I mean, we'll certainly investigate it. But there aren't.
I'm sure that information is available. Those who have.
Oh, we can work that. Yeah.
Yeah, ran in past state or federal elections, but there's a security.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so page 2. That's the right one. Might make it supposed to be H2B, I think. There's a positive association between managers' participation on non-profit boards and the level of political donations by that manager or directors employing corporation. Okay, possibly the more interesting stuff, if contingent on whether or not people have any faith that we've done things well in the first two hypotheses, is the role of governance mechanisms in constraining the influence of managers' personal interests over the donations. Okay, now the interpretation of this, again, is contingent on people having a degree of faith that we've captured corporate interests for corporate political donations, and to the extent that we don't, that the omitted bit isn't correlated with our managerial private interests. Okay, obviously we can't capture every corporate interest for a corporate political donation. So, and I'd be rude, like if anyone can immediately see, hang on, what you're measuring as a private interest here for management is obviously correlated with this incentive for the corporation, please tell me, because I'll have to do it, it's a killer. Okay, so corporations employ a variety of mechanisms and structures with which to govern decision making, and they're ostensibly intended to protect the interests of key stakeholders, equity holders, creditors, etc. These mechanisms in traditional literature include monitoring mechanisms by which delegates of the shareholders monitor executive decisions, most typically through the board. There's also monitoring by stakeholders with sufficient incentive and power to monitor directly. Blockholders. Now, in our definition of blockholders, we exclude insiders or people that blockholders that we can obviously see are the insider themselves. But again, this is if a blockholder is sitting behind a nominee company, that's a bit trickier. And interest alignment mechanisms, managerial and directorial share ownership. The argument being, going back to the traditional Jensen and Meckling and even earlier literature, being the proportion of the manager or the proportion of the firm that the decision maker owns will increase the extent of their natural incentive alignment.
Can I just ask a quick question about the blockholders? So,
yeah.
In finance, this has been a bit of a nightmare, to say the least. There's a literature that says blockholders should matter, and then you're looking at actually the level first maybe starts to work in the wrong direction, so you need a large second blockholder. Have you considered multiple blockholders at all?
Definitely tried yeah.
Like
in the
first two, I think the first two seem to get a Guernsey in a lot of the governance literature. Right?
Yeah, look, the answer is yes, and this isn't a very good follow-up, supplement. I can't remember the entire set of stuff that was tried in the last couple of years, etc. But I will go and double-check that. It was something that Louise did play around a lot with, but I accept your point. And look, there are threshold effects, there are the number of block holders. So you also tried alternate measures in terms of, looking at top 20%,
Which is probably not going to tell you a great deal. It's more like it's more like dispersion of the board. But if you're looking for monitoring, sometimes the second one's important. It depends on how big your sample is.
We've got about approximately 200 unique firms.
The other thing
any firm that was,
But I just think when you look at these individuals, the other thing that worries me a bit is why these large stakeholders, the largest, should be so important in your result. And secondly, I'm sort of wondering why political donations are necessarily seen as an issue. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but it might actually be profit maximising for some firms, and you're sort of perhaps cutting off some variables that might help to explain this relationship. Because it seems to me you're sort of looking for monitoring in terms of controlling and making sure the business doesn't do it. But I'm wondering if that's actually rational for the business.
We're not trying to stop. We don't see the board as, like, for example, in our first specification of the equation, they're just the governance things are just control variables, and that in themselves. What we want to see is whether or not they whether or not they mitigate the effect of the managerial private interest proxies on donations. Not necessarily. We don't care so much about what the coefficient is on the governance proxy. We don't necessarily have it. So we don't view donations as value destroying, but to the extent that the donations correlate with the managerial private interest proxies, we expect the interaction term to have the opposite sign. So we're not saying donations are necessarily bad, clearly not. Now, obviously, this is all contingent on how well we've specified this model.
Yeah.
So, I think your underlying point is correct. But, I mean, the other issue is to what extent are we picking up firms' broader political activity through the donation behaviour, it's positively correlated. Our donations that we've measured are positively correlated to about sort of 30% with the list of firms that said in 2007 we pay lobbyists and we've got registered lobbyists. We can't observe them before that because that was the first time that firms had to say we're paying lobbyists, etc. But you could sort of see that it was one bloke at Macquarie sat there and told me, no, they only make donations when the lobbying doesn't work. He didn't have any evidence for the assertion, and I'm sure that sometimes happens.
Did you get many donations where it's 50-50? one for the Liberal, one for the
Lots.
Labor. Yeah.
Yeah, lots. No, this is why we do study the total donations. Well, partly also, you've got to get through both houses. It's a bicameral system, and I think it's a long-run bet.
Mm.
That's my, you want doors to be open to your lobbyists.
Yeah.
That's my gut feeling, and we don't make that case properly at all in the paper at the moment. We've got a lot of work to do.
Sure. It's just a question.
Mark, I still don't see. I mean, I agree with Richard's point because we raised that in the morning. And if you look at the managerial interest and also the donation, you're saying that if the corporate governance or these block holders actually has an effect, then it should go the opposite direction. But I don't. If what they're actually doing is not wrong per se in terms of not suboptimal, then I don't see why.
Because we're not making a prediction about the main effect variable for the governance variables. We're making a prediction for its interaction with the managerial private interest. So we're predicting the managerial private interest will have a positive coefficient, but that becomes less positive if governance is stronger.
But aren't you then supposing that the governance actually, that's something that governance should act on? And I think
That's a question of materiality. I mean, if it's, I guess my a priori assumption here is that governance should act on non-value maximising behaviour, but of course there's a materiality issue here. So these may not be very large, And look, my major concern here is that what we possibly pick up is just unobserved corporate motivations, and we've got to do some, we've got to be more convincing in that regard.
Yeah, so the assumption is that your measures of managerial private interest are negatively related to corporate interests, in essence. Or they overwork.
But their coefficients will only be significant if they explain more than just the corporate interest we've.
Yeah, but they're not also proxies for corporate
Yes,
interests.
for unobserved corporate interest. Yes, that's exactly my concern.
If you can capture their outside interests in terms of their networks, if those networks are consistent with the industry or the firm where they align, then it could have the other effect, right?
Yeah, we do control for industry.
No, what I mean is if I'm a director of a company, but I'm also a board of a wilderness or some kind of greenie society, then you can see where my personal interests come in.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm chairman of the Minerals Association or something like that, then my interests will be aligning with the company and the company's profit making rather than my personal interests. So you need to capture that. There might be both sides as well.
Just your actual donations itself relates to federal donations, is that right?
In the main test, it's total donations to the federal level of parties, but we also show results at the state level as well in our sensitivity tests. Get broadly similar results. The state stuff gets quite, because we know that the donations to the state bodies can be intended to be channeled to the federal level. Just the timing of all the various different state issues and elections within this just confuses it a lot, but we broadly get similar results. Philip?
Is there anything to be gained from looking at the composition of the donations? You're saying you add them together regardless of whether they are to one party or another. Is there something to be gained from looking at the split?
The reason for it was we do show the split. We do run regressions on the parties themselves. What we haven't done, I don't think we've used the bias, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, as a dependent in itself, though, into or the difference. But
I was thinking of it in terms of when you start looking at sort of related boards, what they're up to, etc.
Yeah, actually, that is something we certainly haven't done in terms of. Yeah, I now can see. Yeah, no, but that's a good point. That's something we can definitely do. We've got the data for that. Thank you. Okay. So, look, if the donations are potentially motivated by managerial rather than corporate interests, can governance mechanisms discipline such behaviour is our question. Okay, put some animations in for me. So our hypothesis development, board monitoring, traditional explanations are independent directors may provide more effective monitoring, but of course independent directors are generally outside directors and they may have weaker information sets. independent directors may also pursue their own private interests in this case. So that, it's possible that some of the independent directors maybe have some self-interested motivations. I wouldn't say to initiate it. I mean, it's hard to see how an independent director is likely to actually initiate the decision to donate to a political party, but they may fail to, or they may ratify a donation that they otherwise wouldn't. So what we've got here is the relation between donations and managers' private interest is moderated by board independence. We don't have a directional prediction there. We really don't know how that's going to go. Block holders, and these are external block holders. These are block holders that we can identify who are not management and are not associated with a related corporation, which isn't such a big issue in the top 100. If we went outside that, then you get all the Joe Goodnick's mining companies with the same CEO and stuff. These guys, okay, so our block holders are people with sufficient incentives and voting power to constrain managers. We predict that the relation between corporate political donations and managers' private interest motives is reduced as the number of block holders is increased. So we have a directional prediction here, and I guess that's a bit. I mean, I guess it's partly because I guess it depends what assumptions people make about the identity of these block holders that we are left with after we take the insiders out. Okay. And our interest alignment mechanisms are all to do with share ownership and equity holdings of either managers or outside directors. And it comes down to an interest alignment versus entrenchment or power effect. Obviously, if they own more of the firm, they have a stronger incentive to maximise the value of the firm. But to the extent that that directors or managers may wish to inspire or allow donations that meet their personal interests, their ability to actually have their wishes seen to is actually an increasing function of their votes, and that's of their ownership stake. Okay, so again, we have a non-directional hypothesis there. Measurement of variables. We take the natural log of 1 plus total donations by the corporation to the registered political parties. Okay, in our sensitivity analysis, we split it up by the coalition, the Labor Party, and I don't think we did enough for the Greens. Yeah, Ronnie.
Coming back to my earlier point,
Yep.
and also addressing Philip's concern with regard to common denominator, it would be interesting if the dependent variable would be the changes in the donations that are scaled, and probably also return on assets changes, because then there should be, I'm sure that the changes in profitability will be associated, and you won't have a common denominator problem.
We did do some changes to models. They're pretty noisy because you can multiply the noise in an already noisily measured variable.
But what happens then to your variables of interest if you have the changes? Do they stay significant, or?
I don't think all of them did it in every single model. There was a while ago that did that. What is also not tabulated here, we did run fixed effects models and strip those out. And something Louise just did last week, we just aggregated 7 years and then just ran one cross-sectional regression, and that also gives consistent results. Right, now, I don't know if that's good or bad, but
it's surprising
yeah.
that your Torbit model reveals the same results as the OLS and also the Farmer Macbeth, and I'm not sure whether this is the reason is the dependent variable.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the dependent variable. And we did try multiple variants of the Tobit models because of the fact that the censoring threshold moves.
Yeah.
And it comes in. Okay, our corporate interest proxies. We measure corporate exposure to parliamentary government decision making by counting the number of citations of the corporation's name in Hansard. Okay, for the year. Tried logging that, didn't help. They're pretty low numbers, so for many of them. Now that also includes not just the parent corporation, but all wholly owned subsidiaries. So Louise went through the whole list of that. I mean, spent some time running through Hansard's. It's electronic now, so but it's still, yeah, she didn't have a life for a little while. So she entertains herself very well. Yeah, she hates me, that's any problem. we measure corporate exposure to government decision-making outside Parliament in two ways. One is the number of times the corporation or its subsidiaries are named in the government gazettes, excluding the government tendering gazette, because we look at government tendering practices through the reports of the number of government contracts awarded to these corporations and to their wholly owned subsidiaries. Now, it is just the number of contracts. We can't measure consistently the value, but I think we might be able to at least classify them in levels. So I'm going to have a look at that.
Do you try the lag of the number of contracts? Because when you make the donation in one
Yeah, no, we tried. That's one we've tried multiple different lags of, and also just turning it into a dichotomous variable. Did you get one or not?
Okay.
We did try there, and no, but that was we thought for a long time about actually, okay, what is the sequence in here if you did this logically? Yeah. The big problem is you can't observe the unsuccessful tenders, so we don't know that.
What about something like legal cases? You know, the number of times if you're taking on the government in the High Court, or you're being sued, or you're being prosecuted for, your company's continually being prosecuted for environmental offences, or you're spending a lot of time, or you're a union back, you're spending a lot of time in arbitration.
I mean, if I do actually have the environmental stuff from the
Yeah.
paper, I think, so I could have a look. And we do have multiple measures of exposure that are, some are used as
Those exposures,
media
and they'll
exposure,
all
for
be
example.
directional to which party you're going, depending on where you are, which party you want to give the money to get out of that problem.
Okay. I'll have a look, because we do have some other data I've collected for various reasons that might help. Okay, managerial private interests. Our first proxy for this is the incidence of corporate political donations within the managers or directors' professional network, which is the network of other boards that they sit on, not just in the top 100 firms either. So if we consider the firm for which we're measuring this, and we call it the focal corporation, let's say we're just talking about their CEO, and their CEO sits on 4 other boards, and 2 of those other boards make disclosed corporate political donations, then that's what we're picking up here. We've also tried it with the value of those donations, and I don't think it makes much difference. I think the actual number of interlocked corporations was more descriptive. So then we transform that into an average per director. So if the average director on a board sits on 3 other corporations, on the board of 3 other corporations that make donations, that's what we end up with. Okay, just to control the effect of power. That transformation is not important to the results. It's just logical thought. Okay. There should be one that's about the social directorships, okay, and the non-profit directorships as well. And so we bottle that. Got rid of it there. Okay, the measures of variables, our corporate governance mechanism, board independence, typical power ratio stuff, ratio of non-executive directors to the number of executives. We don't account for great directors in this. We do have board size as a control, so the board independence is at least slightly meaningful. If you don't have board size in there, board independence just typically goes up as boards get bigger, because you can't add any more executives, so it's pretty meaningless without it. Blockholder monitoring, the number of external shareholders who hold 5% or more of the corporation's ordinary shares. Level of executive shareholdings and level of executive shareholdings and non-executive shareholdings we treat similarly. So our control variables, as I said before, we've got firm size, which I think in the main paper is log of total assets, but we've also, it doesn't matter if we use log of market value of equity or log of total revenues as alternate size measures. Media exposure, which is a count of the number of times that the firm or its subsidiaries are mentioned in the TV, print, and radio media as reflected on this database that you can get through Parliament House. It's not Media Monitors, it's called Media something else, and so Louise has done a series of fuzzy searches through that. Board size, profitability here is ROA, but tried multiple different indicators of profitability, including including cash flow from operations-based ones, and industry and near dummies were relevant. They're obviously not in the Fundamental Debt models for these index. Okay, so the first model regresses donations against corporate interest indicators, private interest indicators, and in this first model in our test of H1, H2, the corporate governance indicators are just controls. We don't predict that they have that there should be a main effect of these corporate governance donations on donations. What we then do to test H3 to 5 is we take all of that and then we add to it interactions sequentially between each of our corporate governance indicators and the private interest indicators. We did do a model, or Louise did in the thesis, where they're all putting together, and it becomes a bit messy when you've got so many interactions in a moderate sample size. But in this, to answer your question, Marvin, we make no prediction for the main effect of board independence, but we predict that if the private interest indicator that we're talking about is positive, okay, in terms of its main effect, that this will be negative, making the effect of the private interest indicator less positive. That's what our prediction is. We're not saying that we view all corporate political donations as value destroying. We're saying to the extent that those donations reflect private interests above and beyond what we can identify as corporate interests. Now, again, it's the right start.
When you say that you don't predict direction, that means if that's actually negative, then you're presuming that it should be the opposite?
It should be the opposite of the we definitely predict that the private interest indicators are positive, and that the interaction is negative. That's our prediction. Doesn't work most times.
Yeah.
And number
but
of
the way the hypothesis is then written, if that actually comes out as negative, then you predict that should be positive, right? Which then is a bit odd, really. Because if private interest in donations is negative, because you say moderated, right?
I've lost it.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
a couple of direct. Yeah,
but
let's put an example down. Okay, if our private interest indicator is the donations within the CEOs, or within executives' professional networks, we expect that to increase corporate political donations when we're testing it up here. So let's say we get a positive and significant coefficient for that. When we interact that with the governance mechanisms, we predict that the interaction will be negative, with the opposite sign, that it makes it smaller.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting. Yeah. Okay, so we then sequentially run through substituting the different governance indicators. I'll jump over the descriptions. They're in the paper. This is Louise largely explaining why she focused on the top 100 rather than the top 500. Because she would have gone crazy if you did any more. But the top 100 are responsible for the vast majority of corporate political donations that meet the disclosure threshold. That's basically the point. Okay, so our sample is any firm that was in the top 100 Australian listed corporations ranked by either market cap or revenues at the end of any year during between 2000 and 2007. So if you're in there once, you stay in. Okay, so that results in 1339 firm-year observations with 160 to 170 observations in each year. After excluding firms with missing data, now you can see there's a pretty big attrition there. This is largely the first year or the last year of a firm's life. Most of that sample attrition there, nearly all of it is, the first cases where the firm had only existed for 3 months in that year, and that later on they became part of the top 100, etc. So I will present that very differently when we rewrite this. This shows donations to in total and to each of the political parties. So you can see donations to the coalition were a bit over 10 million, donations to the ALP about 7.2, and bearing in mind the coalition was in power the whole time throughout this sample. And minor parties 255,000. We add them up, but we have run the regressions on using donations to the coalition and donations to the ALP as different as dependent variables with no major difference to our results. Okay, I will fly through these. This is just petition. these are descriptive and then petitioning on the donate or not donate. I've also tried a few sort of Heckman type variants on models and allowing different coefficients for donors and non-donors. That doesn't seem to make a big difference. It's not surprising given the similarity with the Tobit model. Yep.
So timing of the donation, sort of interesting in view of if you want to pick a winner and made your donation 6 months or a year before the election, more crucial than someone just making one randomly very early in the piece?
They certainly, I think the quick answer is yeah. And they certainly do cluster in the pre-election years. We've run it in pre-election years, and we certainly get consistent results. I can't remember what happens in the non-election years. You don't get much of a sample, and so you get this really lumpy distribution. But what we haven't done, and I'm pretty sure we haven't looked at. I think part of the problem is we don't know the intra-year timing of the donation. We just know that it happened in that reporting year. I think that's the problem. Yep.
Sorry, with your two variables that you did talk about, the non-profit, this soft director executive one,
Yeah.
you got the maximum, which is 600. So that tells me that for each director, they actually take on 6 other roles in non-profit organization.
Average of 6, yeah. I have to check that one out.
Yeah,
It does look a bit weird.
that's right. It's
Looks-
pretty huge. And
yeah,
then
that
in the
no, you're
regression
right.
models, these actually come up significant.
Yeah. No,
I'm just not sure.
that's for the that's for the executive. So that'll be a firm. That's plausible, but you're right. Just in terms of distributional effect. Yeah. That's going to be a firm where they've got one executive on board, and they're on six other social directors. So it's probably not an error, but I will double check that. Thank you. And we have done all sorts of tests with truncation and Windsorization of variables as well, but not as a first response. These are on untruncated and unwindsorized data. Circles. Okay. Summary of our results for the basic hypotheses for the corporate interests and managerial private interests. Our corporate interest indicators are up the top in the top 3 rows. I apologise for the control variables not being listed here, but they are in the regression. I will fix that in future iterations of the paper. We find that exposure to Parliament, that is, the number of times the firms mentioned in Parliament, is positive and significant, regardless of whether we assess this using OLS with clustered standard errors, Farmer-Macbeth regressions, or a Tobit regression, in this case, and setting the left censoring the data at $1,000, which is the reporting above which you actually have to report. We don't find much for the non-parliamentary decision-making incentives, but again, maybe they're just really bad course proxies, I don't know. We'll look to improve them to the extent we can. We do get one random significant result here in the Farmer-Macbeth method. I want to have a look at that to see whether that's just one large angle coefficient, because it's Farmer-Macbeth in 8 years. We might, I don't know, we might lose the Farmer-Macbeth and use something like, we used to have a fixed effects model in here. If we do manage to get a better sequence changes model in, I'll have a look at that too. So the managerial private indicators, just focusing on OLS for the discussion, we find significant results in the predicted direction for each of those indicators of varying strength. So the incidence of donations within executives' professional network is positive and significant. Similarly with donations within the non-executive directors' networks, and the incidence of social directorships are also there. Now, of course, these are the ones where we identify the potential obvious endogeneity threat, particularly the first two, and that is, if the firm actually wants to go out and obtain some sort of political influence, they might go and hire directors who are already politically connected and are in donating corporations. Okay, so we run some 2-stage regressions with the first stage that predicts each of these endogenous variables, and as instruments we use the number of boards on which you sit, essentially, so a busyness measure which shouldn't obviously be correlated with the residuals in the structural equation, and one other thing I'll see it if we get to the actual sensitivity tests. we ran that, and the results stayed relatively similar. What was significant stayed significant. Standard diagnostic tests for under-identification and exogeneity weren't tripped. And we tried it with, limiting the number of instruments as well, because to run the Sargent test, you've got to have one more instrument than you need. And the second one was a bit weak. Very weak. So we find some support for our hypotheses about managerial private interests, but again, we're assuming that we've captured corporate, the effect of corporate interests, or at least to the extent that we haven't captured the corporate interests, they're not correlated with these variables. More animations. Right. Now, you might need some binoculars, because I probably do from this range. This is a summary of the tests for H3 through H5, and the interest here is on the interaction terms, which are down in the bottom half. The main effect terms stay in the predicted direction for our private interests. And we're predicting that if particular governance mechanism was effective in constraining managerial private interests, that we'd get a negative and significant coefficient on the interaction between that. I'll come to you in 2 secs. And most of it, we don't find anything, but block holders, we do find some evidence of negative coefficients for the interaction between block holders and the number of non-profit directorships that management hold. And what's the other one? Yeah, that was it. We find that of our executive and non-executive shareholding governance measures, they in fact have significant positive associations with the impact of some of the managerial private interest indicators. And that's sort of, we're not surprised by that because the extent of a director's share ownership, okay, yeah, it affects